I was raised in a household that could politically best be described as Eisenhower Republican. It was that understanding of politics and values that were instilled in me as a child, nurtured by the world around me, and guided me for most of my life. It kept me in the good graces with friends on both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, who saw those values not so much as a mark of partisanship, but rather of simply being a good American. And so you can imagine my shock when not so long ago I was called a rhino, Republican in name only. But it didn't stop there. I have been called woke. I have been accused of not preaching the Bible, but rather some new age social gospel. I've been accused of being gay, of being a socialist, of being a baby killer, and far worse, but that's not to be shared here. In short, what was a gift from my parents, or at least they thought so, had now marked me as subversive. The same thing happened with Sabbath keeping in the ancient days. Sabbath keeping was a gift from God. It is one of those 10 commandments that God gives to provide for good community and good health, for keeping the people of God in safety. It is a day that God deemed necessary for good health, both physical and emotional, to take a day off from labor, to rest, to also remember that God will provide. One can take a day off because God will provide that daily need. It is also a time of family and a time to care for those in need. It was a gift of what it meant to live in community. But all that changed when God's people found themselves in exile in Babylon. Suddenly, Sabbath keeping was seen as a mark. In a world, in an economy that was productivity driven, as the Babylonian economy was, the idea of taking time off was simply not acceptable. To keep Sabbath was subversive to the Babylonian way of life. And it marked the Jews as different and in some respects dangerous. It becomes a badge for the Jews, not only marking them as suspect, but also on their end as a mark of what it means to be Jewish. To be Jewish meant to keep the Sabbath. when they return home following the exile, it also then marks those Jews who went into exile and experienced all this stuff around Sabbath as a mark of what it means to be truly Jewish. Those that did not experience that Babylonian captivity just weren't quite good Jews. And so keeping Sabbath becomes more than just gift, but becomes a badge, a mark of true Jewishness, particularly in the face of occupation, as will happen with the Greeks and the Romans. And so this is the culture that Jesus enters into and begins to mess with in his and his disciples' understanding of Sabbath. And he is accused of being subversive, of undermining the values of good Jewishness, because he fails to keep the letter of the law. His disciples are accused of harvesting. They got hungry, so they plucked some grain. It happened to be the Sabbath. It was technically a violation. Jesus raises the issue of healing on the Sabbath and questions those who would oppose his doing so. Well, wouldn't you do the same for one of your animals? You see, Jesus restores the understanding of the law as being gift, not as being mark, a badge, a litmus test, but rather a gift from God that we need for good health and relationships. Ironically, Eisenhower and the Sabbath had an interesting play together. Because in a world where people saw red, communists around every corner and in every shadow, Eisenhower declared that the litmus test for being a good American was to go to church on Sunday. You could not be a communist if you went to church and believed in God. It was as simple as that. Is it any wonder then that worship attendance explodes in that time? Nor should it surprise us that worship attendance is dwindling these days, because it wasn't based on an understanding of God, but on an understanding of what it meant to be American. And we have other badges these days we can wear. And so why church? Why Sabbath? And we easily slide back into that 24/7 pattern of work. Perhaps it's time to be a little subversive and reclaim the Sabbath, a day of rest, a day to remember who's providing. Not me, but God. A day to enjoy the gift of family, and a day to remember the needs of those around us. The sick, the sorrowful, the lonely. the hurting. Perhaps it's time to be a little subversive. So let's go keep the Sabbath. You may get a few names, but you'll be healthier for it. I promise. Amen.